Hello my dear friends, welcome to Hauntra. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and press the bell icon so that you don't miss any exciting coming up videos. When Sarah moved into the old Victorian house on Maple Street, she was eager for a fresh start. The house was perfect, spacious, cozy, and tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The only drawback was the house's previous owner. No one seemed to know exactly what happened to her. The neighbors were tight-lipped about it, offering only vague responses. Still, Sarah was determined to make this her home. After all, the price was too good to pass up. The moving process was long, but she was finally settled in, ready for a new chapter in her life. On her first morning, Sarah noticed something unsettling. The street, though quiet, was unnervingly still. No children playing, no dogs barking, not even the sound of distant traffic. As she unpacked, she caught glimpses of her neighbors through their windows. They seemed to watch her, but quickly turned away whenever she looked back. She shrugged it off as the usual curiosity of new neighbors, but a small voice inside her began to wonder if something wasn't quite right. That afternoon, she ventured to meet Mrs. Caldwell, the neighbor next door. Mrs. Caldwell was a small, frail woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through Sarah. She greeted her with a smile that felt a little too wide, a little too forced. They talked for a while, but Sarah felt the conversation drift into awkward silences. Mrs. Caldwell mentioned her husband, who hadn't been around for years. But when Sarah asked about him, Mrs. Caldwell became oddly quiet. She quickly changed the topic and told Sarah that she should be careful at night. "This neighborhood can be unpredictable," she said cryptically. Sarah dismissed it as the ramblings of an elderly woman, but her unease grew. Over the next few weeks, Sarah started noticing something even stranger. Mrs. Caldwell had a large, ornate rocking chair on her front porch, but it remained still, never moving even in the wind. Every time Sarah looked out her window, the chair would be there, unmoving. The house next door appeared to be completely empty, with no sounds of activity coming from inside. The curtains were always drawn, and the lights were never on. Despite her earlier conversation, Mrs. Caldwell seemed to have disappeared, and no one had seen her since. Sarah felt an odd sense of foreboding growing within her. One evening, Sarah returned home to find the front door slightly ajar. She was sure she had locked it when she left for work that morning. Cautiously, she entered the house, her heart pounding in her chest. Everything appeared untouched, except for a small pile of dirt near the doorway, as though someone had recently walked through the house with dirty shoes. She checked the windows, all securely locked, and tried to brush it off as her imagination. But as she sat down on the couch, the feeling of being watched returned. That night, Sarah awoke to the sound of faint whispers drifting through the walls. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the words were too distinct, too clear. "Sarah," the voice whispered. She bolted upright in bed, her heart racing. She quickly checked the house, but there was no one. The whispers seemed to come from every direction, filling the house with a sense of suffocating dread. She could feel them getting closer. The voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it. The next day, Sarah went to the local library to learn more about the history of the house. There, she found a dusty old newspaper clipping. It was about Mrs. Caldwell's family. The article mentioned a tragic event. Her husband had vanished mysteriously years ago, leaving her to live alone in the house. But there was no mention of her current whereabouts. The library attendant told Sarah that Mrs. Caldwell had lived in the house for decades, but no one had seen her for weeks. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Later that evening, Sarah glanced out her window to see Mrs. Caldwell's rocking chair moving slowly back and forth. She could see Mrs. Caldwell in the chair, but she wasn't moving, just staring straight ahead, her face emotionless. As Sarah watched, the figure in the chair began to fade, becoming less distinct until it was no longer there. Sarah rushed outside, but the chair was empty, swaying slightly in the wind. The eerie feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. One night, Sarah was woken by the sound of heavy footsteps outside her bedroom door. She opened her eyes to find a dark figure standing in the hallway. It was tall, almost inhuman, and it moved with a strange, jerky motion, as though it were dragging something behind it. Frozen in fear, Sarah watched as the figure passed through her bedroom door, its silhouette barely visible in the dark. When she finally summoned the courage to get up, the hallway was empty. The following morning, Sarah received a strange phone call. The voice on the other end was distorted, but she could make out a few words. "Come to the basement. You're too late." Before she could respond, the call ended. The message sent a shiver through her spine. The house had a basement, but she had never ventured down there. Hesitant but curious, Sarah decided to investigate. Sarah slowly descended the stairs, her flashlight flickering in the damp, cold air. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and boxes covered in dust. At the far end, she noticed a small wooden door, hidden behind a stack of boxes. She pushed them aside, her heart pounding, and opened the door. Inside, she found a strange room filled with old photographs and memorabilia, most of it focused on the Caldwell family. As she looked closer, she noticed one photograph that caught her eye. It was of Mrs. Caldwell, but there was someone else in the photo, a tall, shadowy figure standing behind her. As Sarah examined the photo, her fingers trembling, the truth began to dawn on her. The shadowy figure in the photo was wearing a mask, an old, white porcelain mask that seemed familiar. The mask resembled the one that Mrs. Caldwell's husband had once been seen wearing before his disappearance. Sarah's mind raced with questions. Who was this figure? Was it really him, or something else? Suddenly, the room grew colder, and a chill ran down her spine. The basement seemed to close in on her as the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. As Sarah struggled to open the door, she heard a whisper. Soft at first, but growing louder. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was unmistakably Mrs. Caldwell's, but there was something wrong with it. It was hollow, as though it had been distorted by time. Her heartbeat quickened as she frantically tried to push the door open. The voice continued, now accompanied by footsteps, slow, deliberate, and drawing closer. Just as Sarah finally forced the door open, she was grabbed from behind. A cold, skeletal hand locked around her wrist, its grip unyielding. In the cold grip of the hand, Sarah turned to face her attacker. But the figure wasn't Mrs. Caldwell. It was the same shadowy, masked figure from the photograph. Its face was concealed by the porcelain mask, but its eyes were dark and hollow, staring directly into Sarah's soul. The figure didn't speak. Instead, it slowly dragged her toward the back of the basement, where a stone wall was hidden behind more boxes. Sarah struggled, but the figure was unnaturally strong. She realized then that the figure wasn't human. It was something far darker. With one final push, the figure opened the stone wall to reveal a hidden doorway. The air was thick with the scent of decay and rot. Inside the room, Sarah's eyes fell upon a collection of strange items. Jars filled with what looked like human remains, old clothes, and broken mirrors. A makeshift altar stood at the center, covered with symbols Sarah didn't recognize. The masked figure gestured toward the altar as though waiting for Sarah to understand something. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized This was where Mrs. Caldwell's husband had disappeared. This was where people came to be trapped forever. Sarah backed away, trying to make sense of the horror in front of her. The masked figure took one slow step forward, and Sarah felt the weight of its gaze. The air grew thicker, and the temperature dropped as a shadow seemed to engulf her. Suddenly, a voice echoed in her mind. A voice that was not her own. "Escape while you still can." The words were urgent, desperate. Sarah looked around, but there was no one else there. She understood then that the warning had come from Mrs. Caldwell. It was too late for her, but Sarah still had a chance to escape. With all the strength she could muster, Sarah broke free from the figure's grasp and ran toward the narrow, dimly lit staircase that led back to the main floor. The basement door slammed shut behind her as she sprinted toward the exit. She could hear the figure's footsteps following closely, growing faster, but she didn't dare look back. She made it out of the house and onto the front porch, gasping for breath. But as she looked around, the quiet street seemed to stretch endlessly. She wasn't free. Sarah ran down the porch steps into the yard, but the figure wasn't far behind. She heard its footsteps, even though she couldn't see it anymore. The street was still eerily quiet, and no one else was around. The houses on either side of her seemed to watch her, their windows dark and lifeless. It was then that she realized Mrs. Caldwell had been trying to warn her all along. The entire neighborhood was part of this nightmare, and now it was her turn to be trapped. As Sarah reached the end of the street, she turned to find the masked figure standing just behind her, its eerie, empty eyes fixed on her. She screamed, but the figure didn't move. Instead, it tilted its head as though studying her. The air around her grew thick and suffocating. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, and the street began to blur and distort. The figure raised its hand, and Sarah's vision went black. She felt herself being pulled away into the darkness. The next morning, the neighbors noticed something strange. Sarah's house, once full of life, was now silent. The porch light was flickering, and the front door was ajar. But Sarah was never seen again. Mrs. Caldwell's rocking chair, which had remained motionless for so long, was once again swaying gently in the breeze. The house on Maple Street had claimed another victim, and the silence, once again, returned to the street. The cycle was complete. Thanks for watching, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for more new videos.